I'd like to introduce our presenter tonight, Sharlot Hart. And Sharlot is going to be talking, her subject is Talking Turkey, Domestic Turkey in the U.S. Southwest Archaeological Record, and a little bit about them today. She is an archaeologist with the National Park Service. She works for the Southern Arizona office of the Park Service, which is located actually in Phoenix, but she's actually physically working here in Tucson. And she's been with this part of the agency for 6 years. She was born in Phoenix and spent most of her life in Arizona. She has a bachelor's degree in history, a minor in botany, and she has a master's in anthropology with a specialization in applied archaeology. And both of these are all from the University of Arizona, which is my alma mater as well, right? She spent 2 years with a Peace Corps in Madagascar, and she worked with agroforestry as well as with the silk weavers, which I think would be a great program to hear sometime, actually, in Madagascar. In 2009, she started with the agency working at Tuzigut and Montezuma Castle as a park ranger slash park guide, which means that she has a real background in interpretation. She currently, in addition to what she does for SOAR, which is the Southern Arizona office of the Park Service, SOAR, where she does a lot of compliance aspects and does sort of on the ground archaeology and historical and cultural management, resource management stuff. But she also, she was telling me yesterday that she has a couple of sort of pet projects, I think. One is on agaves and how were traded back and forth with Mexico. And then the longevity, how adobe and adobe walls historically have been affected by the local environments. She's on the board of the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society, and if that's not enough to keep her busy, she's married and is the mother. So I asked Sharlot how she got to be interested in this program, and she said she's just basically fascinated by turkeys. So, Sharlot, I'm going to shut up. Hopefully I haven't embarrassed you too much, and thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you for that introduction, Butch. I'm very excited to be here, and it was pretty much all correct. I'll own up to all of that. So. Let me start. Let me start sharing here. Wonderful. Okay, so. Today we're here to talk about turkeys, and as Butch said, I am fascinated by them. One of the jobs of a person or the roles of a person in my job is to know about be a generalist essentially about the different collections that we have, and this opportunity came up to learn about turkeys that the turkey remains that we care for. So it turned into this great talk, and I'm really excited to give it a little bit more on that. I am really excited about the connections between natural and cultural resources with that minor in botany and the work that I do looking at changing weather regimes on adobe walls on earthen architecture. Has led to me collaborating a lot with the National Park Service's natural resource inventory folks, and monitoring folks. So this came out of that collaboration a little bit as well. So getting going. I hope you all love turkeys. You all signed up for this talk, so let's get going. I do want to, I guess before we get into turkeys, I want to give an acknowledgement, and it's a little bit of a land acknowledgement, but it's a little bit more than that. It's a personal acknowledgement that the sites that I'm going to talk about today, where these turkey remains have come from, they all sit on ancestral homelands. And because it's a big survey talk, they sit on the ancestral homelands of many, many, many tribes. And those include the Hopi tribe, the Pueblo of Zuni, the Navajo Nation, the Ute Indian tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, Okeowenge, the Pueblos of Kewa, Acoma, Cochiti, Isleta, Jamez, Laguna, Nambe, Picuris, Poake, San Felipe, San Ildefonso, Sandia, Santa Ana, Santa Clara, Taos, Tesuque, Isleta del Sur of Texas, and Zia, as well as the Fort Sill Apache, Jicarilla, Mescalero, San Carlos, White Mountain, and Yavapai Apache nations. I further want to recognize their enduring presence on these lands, and that that I am talking about their heritage as much as I am about an archaeological record. So I thank them for being able to learn about and work on and share regarding their traditional lands. I also apologize to all of you for my dog. He's, I think, a little bit worked up with the different weather patterns himself. So now we'll get to this turkey. Hopefully the dog doesn't go after a turkey, which is Melagus gallopavo. This is the North American wild turkey. There are 2 species of turkeys in North America. So this is the predominant one, and the one that here in the US we see, you know, around Thanksgiving, lots of images of. If you're a hunter, you might see this guy in the forest. And then there's the oscillated turkey. And we're not going to talk about the oscillated turkey again, really, in this talk. I just think it's an amazing looking bird, and that you all should see it. Also to be able to see the differences in the different species, because we're going to be talking a lot about subspecies of the North American wild turkey. So this oscillated turkey is found in Oaxaca, Mexico, as we can see on this map here. So this is a status of the wild turkey recently, about this map is 20 years old. And you can see here the oscillated turkey is really relegated down in Mexico. And then there's a number of species throughout the US, I'm sorry, a number of subspecies. So there's 5 subspecies. Gould's wild turkey, we're going to talk about a lot. And in this map, it's pretty much relegated to Mexico. You can see maybe a couple little dots if you really squint here in Arizona, and then the red is the Merriam's wild turkey, which you can see along the Mogollon Rim, Colorado Plateau, and then in a lot of these Sky Islands. So we'll keep that in mind for just a little while. So if we come down to Chiricahua, Chiricahua is a Sky Island as well. And I was lucky enough to spend a winter there as a park guide before I became an archaeologist. So I spent a season there, and I had an amazing time at Chiricahua. And the reason we're going to start here first is that we're staying on a description of kind of turkeys and getting a background on turkeys before we go into artifacts specifically. But the Chiricahua Mountains, and for those of you who haven't heard the term Sky Island before, Sky Islands are mountain ranges that reach up into this part of Arizona and part of New Mexico, and then come down into northern Mexico. And they're mountain ranges where the ecology on top of the mountain is completely different from the desert below, meaning that the mountain ranges are kind of islands in the sky. So Animals like coatimundis, if you've ever heard of them, can exist up in these mountain ranges, but they don't really swim between the different mountain ranges. So the Chiricahua specifically, they are a mountain range that the Jesuit Juan Nentwig, he was riding around in the 1700s, and between 1750 and 1766, he wrote that his companions and party were looking for water, and that they were directed to the Chiricahua Mountains. And he wrote that the Opata, who they had met, specifically said that that was the place of wild turkeys. So,
excuse me, Charlotte, we've had a question in the chat about whether you can enlarge your images at all. I know you're not using PowerPoint for this, so I don't know if you can.
I am not. Let's see here.
Yeah, it may not be possible, I'm not sure. For our viewers out there, one thing that might help you is if you can click on the little double white bar between Charlotte's photograph and her screen images. You can click and drag that to the right. It'll make your image a little larger on the screen. So if it doesn't work, Charlotte, don't worry about it.
Okay. Yeah, increasing the image just increases the size of the text, and you want to see the pictures, you don't want to see the text. Okay, so Chiricahua also recently has been the place of the reintroduction of Gould's wild turkeys. So Gould's is a subspecies that was, if we can go back to this map, Gould's is the species that is mostly in Mexico and just in a couple spots here, but it's traditionally thought of as the species that would have been in the Sky Islands. So these are 3 images of Gould's wild turkeys that have been reintroduced to Chiricahua. These aren't the best photos, so don't blame your own computer's resolution. But I specifically wanted images of turkeys at Chiricahua. Now, I had a great winter there at Chiricahua as a park guide. I got to know a lot about coatimundis and so many other animals in this entirely different kind of ecosystem than where I'd grown up in Phoenix and here in Tucson. And one of the things I loved was that the week before Thanksgiving that year, suddenly there were turkeys everywhere in the park. And most of the mountain range is Forest Service land, but they're in our little square of the Chiricahuas for the Park Service. Hunting isn't allowed. And I figured that these were probably the smartest turkeys that I'd ever met, because they all came into the national park portion of the mountains right around Thanksgiving. So they couldn't be hunted. I know that's not really hunting time, but so it's been a success at Chiricahua. There's over 1,200 turkeys now. And that's in Arizona and New Mexico. It's very close to the New Mexico line. So it's been a success reintroducing these Gould's turkeys, which is really exciting because that's, those are the turkeys that are right there, and that you would think would be the turkeys that the Opata were talking about. And so when we start to look back, we can see that if we look back in time, this is a map of the historic range of the wild turkey subspecies. And the red is still the Merriams, the orange is still the Goulds. And you can see they come right up there and they meet. So it's a kind of toss up about exactly where the Merriams and the Goulds, really, they're probably intermixing is what I'm trying to say. The other thing to take away from this different map is that there's this added pink color, and this is the South Mexican subspecies. So historically, there were actually 6 subspecies of the North American turkey. So keep this in mind. I'll have this map come back later, but it'll be small. And if you're already having trouble seeing this map, then you'll have to keep this in mind. But so this is to show there's the 6 subspecies. The South Mexican here in the pink is now extinct. So, and before I go on to that next slide, so the idea and what I was kind of fumbling with saying is that when we look at the archaeological record, there has been an assumption that people domesticated turkeys that they found right outside their door. But these folks over the last 10 years, really pretty recently, 10 to 15 years, have started looking at domestication of turkeys and started to question some of the assumptions that we've had. So these are the front pages of 2 of many articles that have been written over the last 10 to 15 years. And a lot of it started, Camilla Speller here did her dissertation on turkeys in the Southwest, and that has spurred a lot of the other research. So let's take a step back. We've already learned about turkeys and their and their kind of general background. I'm going to show a couple of slides here that actually have nothing to do with the turkey sites, just to get in some points that I assume you know, but to hit home as context for everything that we're going to talk about with the turkeys. And so this is a figure that I took from a different article about the function of site size and the number of neighbors. So I just want to point out how many people really are on the landscape during the pre-contact period. This box up here starts from 1200 to 1250. And you can see most of them are really isolated. I'm sorry, the other way around. So, so there's tons of people on the landscape, and they live along river corridors for the most part. And then there's tons of movement going on as well. This I also took from another paper by Hill and et al. And you can see the Kayenta region, folks are moving around during this 1250 to 1300 period, different population centers. There's a lot of movement as well as trade. So you have people who are actually migrating, and then you have people who are trading all throughout the this pre-contact time period. And we'll get more into time period in a minute. But this is a great map that I love that Colton from the Museum of Northern Arizona put together in about 1941. And it shows, I think one of his main purposes was to kind of bring together the archaeological construct names that he and others were coming up with at the time to talk about these ancient people. But it also shows the trade routes that connected the different cultures that they were seeing in the record, and the folks who were still living on the landscape at the time. And you'll notice there is some east-west trade going on. There's a lot of north-south trade. And if we come here, so this map I put together, and it shows a lot of the sites that I'm talking about today, but also just sites that were in the literature as well, that gave a lot of context for me in putting this talk together. So you can see, the pins, the dark green pins are National Park Service sites. And then the lighter green ball pins are other sites that are in the archaeological literature that I'll talk about. You can see, and these are all related to turkey remains or half turkey remains. There is a really big dearth here below the Mogollon Rim, and there's a good reason for that. It gets too hot. It's not really a turkey place, right? So, and that's more evidence that you know, for a blanket assumption that the turkeys that are being domesticated are the ones right outside your doorstep. So this Northwest trade, or I'm sorry, this trade networks that we look at, a lot of them come down to the ocean to get shell, and that, you know, you can have east-west trade over to the Pacific coast here, but also salt and shell are really important. We also hear a lot about macaws and copper bells. And that's where Pakime comes in, or Casas Grandes. So at Pakime, we know that they are raising macaws. There are also turkey pens. And I apologize for those of you for whom this picture is really small, but this is a picture of the turkey pens at Casas Grandes. They're a little bit different from the macaw pens. And there were, but it looks like they were raising hundreds of birds. And indeed, that connection is really important, as I said, because of all the items that myself as an archaeologist, first as a park guide for the National Park Service, getting kind of an overview of trade networks and what our sites really held and where we were getting different artifacts that were in our collections but wouldn't have been produced there. The north-south trade network is really hammered home. As soon as we start talking about, you know, ball courts at places like Casa Grande, it's especially hammered home because the assumption is that all of this knowledge came up with the copper bells and the macaws, like you see here at Tuzigoot. And so that's, you know, that can really continue the assumption about where turkeys are coming from as well. And this is Sedona, the scarlet macaw. You know, these are so ingrained, the importance of some of these exotic trade items and really, you know, important ceremonial, I don't want to call a bird an object, but are still there. And before the pandemic, we would have Sedona, the scarlet macaw, come out to Tuzigoot to talk about the important links that we have. And here's Tuzigoot, just in case anyone didn't know. It's in central Arizona in the Verde Valley. It's a great place to visit. As Butch said, one of my my first National Park Service position was at Tuzigoot and its sister site, Montezuma Castle. So once Speller, who I mentioned earlier, you know, she starts looking at these things and with others, starts putting together a huge DNA study and taking some DNA studies from some other places. Number 17 down here is a site in Chihuahua, very close to Pakime, that I think Crow Canyon had already done some work with. So she starts looking at all of these different sites that are numbered here, and is able to take 200 turkey samples, 149 of which are ancient. So she's comparing them to 51 more recent samples, and 29 coprolites. And I hope you all know what coprolites are because they figure in later too, from 38 sites in the Southwest US. So she is able to look at DNA of all of these different samples. And she finds that they're not actually coming from Mexico and thus traded through Pakime. Looking at it from the other side, Manin and their colleagues look at the DNA of turkeys from archaeological contexts found in Mexico. And again, 14 is actually that same site, El Calderon in Chihuahua. So they're looking at all of these DNA samples and finding that there's actually no evidence of north-south trade. As Manin says, there's no evidence of shared maternal haplotypes between Mesoamerica and the Southwest USA, in contrast with archaeological evidence for trade of other domestic products. So, so I just set you up for, you know, this pretty amazing right turn. If they're not coming from right outside your door, which they're not, and they're not coming through Pakime or some other north-south trade network, where are they coming from? Well, it turns out that pre-contacted domesticated turkeys, they're not synonymous with local turkeys, as I said, and the vast majority are the Eastern and the Rio Grande turkey. So I know this map is really small, so I'm going to go back and see if I can get you a better one. Probably going to give you car sickness. Here we go. So we're talking about all of this red area here, right? This all like perfectly Merriam's turkey area. And what we're finding is that it's Intermedia, which is the Rio Grande turkey, and Eastern turkeys. It's a mix of those two. They can't say one or the other specifically, which is kind of mind-blowing. For me, the only other kind of evidence of east-west trade that far that really ever stuck with me was from field school, where we were told that there had been found a bison bone and the assumption, a bison toe bone, and the assumption was that it had come with a bison blanket from the plains, which would have been a great trade item, right? But we're talking about domesticating turkeys from that far away, and bringing live animals across what is today, you know, a state and a half. So I'm gonna quickly scroll back. You can close your eyes if this is giving you nightmares. So that's what Speller finds. The other article that I'd put up in the beginning is by Bill Leap. And so a lot of people start looking at this data, that these turkeys are actually more like this turkey that you're seeing on the screen. And this photo was taken at a Kansas park. And the original one that I had up to show, which was taken at from North Dakota at Theodore Roosevelt. So, you know, this begs so many more questions about what is actually going on with domestication and how it happens. So Turkey Pen site is a good place to go to for information on how domestication started, because because it's one of the first sites that has evidence of domestication. So it's located in the BLM's Grand Gulch area, which also is the Bears Ears area, if you've heard about that. And here on the slides I have 0 to 200 CE is the time period for Turkey Pen. That's what the coprolites date to. It's it looks like the site kind of dates to 100 BCE to 500 CE. So this is a site. It's a cliff site, obviously. And let's see here. So this is a back view of the turkey pen. And then in the inset, I have a kind of a front view. So hopefully you can kind of get an idea. It's a large site with these different rooms behind. And what's amazing about this site is that human and turkey coprolites were mixed together. So it's clear that the humans and the turkeys were living in close contact. There is not a lot of evidence of subsistence on the turkeys, and the DNA that was used came from the coprolites. So coprolites are fossilized species. So we can get a lot of data out of dung or scat, although the archaeologist who wrote up the report said that it was definitely not something you wanted to be digging on a hot day, because as your sweat and the humidity mixed with the coprolites, it was pretty smelly. So I'm glad I didn't dig that site, I guess. So this is a huge, just because of the date, it's huge. What Speller and everyone else who have continued looking at those lines of evidence are seeing is that since, for 1,500 years, 0 to about contact, the domesticated turkeys that we're looking at were kept distinct from the Merriams that were right outside in the forest. So these were important birds. They were an important resource, and they were husbanded very well. As far as the husbandry itself, studies are showing that the diet of the groups of turkeys was primarily a C4 diet, and a C4 diet is indicative of corn. A C3 diet is more focused on wild grasses and not a monochromatic diet, essentially. So there has been some evidence that folks on what Jones and his colleagues call the margin, and so they're talking about Tijeras Pueblo here. And the reason they're calling it the margin is that this is the margin of good corn growing area. As you continue east, you don't get great land and weather patterns for growing corn. So at Tijeras, about half of the turkeys seem to be raised on a C4 diet, and half seem to be raised on a C3 diet. So there's a lot of ways that this could pan out. Some ways that turkeys could have a C3 diet and show that without just being wild managed is that they were moved from place to place. So not just kept in pens, but taken to the cornfields where they were able to get more insects, which would have been a really nice benefit as well. So now we come to this question about why they were being husbanded. And the assumption is, well, if you're going to husband a group of birds, you might as well eat them, right? And we love turkey. The folks in the U.S. love turkey at Thanksgiving. That's what I grew up with. But there's not a lot of evidence of subsistence on turkeys. Specifically, that comes from evidence of turkey bones in refuse piles, and the coprolites and the other turkey remains that I've been talking about, where we've been able to get DNA samples, are not from refuse or contexts that would be associated with feasting. They are rather in internments, and then obviously the coprolites are part of the base context. But the folks, some folks who looked at the collection at Arroyo Hondo Pueblo had a really interesting idea, and it wasn't just about the meat, but what about the eggs? And so we're skipping way ahead in time. Arroyo Hondo is 1300 to 1425, so right before contact. And so what they were able to do is with SEM scanning, they were able to look at cone reabsorption. So the image on the left is a figure of the inside of a shell where the mammillary cones have not been reabsorbed, and on the right they have. So the indication is that this left one, which would be figure 7 in their paper, is an early, the egg cracked early before the chick was able to develop. Whereas on the right, this chick hatched. However, their conclusions were, they weren't able to fully conclude whether or not eggs were being eaten. Part of it had to be the sample. When at Arroyo Hondo, one of the reasons they chose to do this study there is that there was a clutch of a number of eggs from a plaza context, which is a place you wouldn't normally think of as, it might have been feasting, but it also could have been a ritualized context. And their sample size wasn't great. And as you can imagine, when archaeologists are screening material, eggshells can very easily fall through. So they weren't conclusive on this, but they have found birds and eggs with in ritualized contexts as well. There is also evidence that mostly after 1250, this quote from Leap starts at 1050, but mostly after 1250, there is evidence of people eating turkeys, but especially that evidence especially comes from places where wild game depletion was happening in Pueblo 2, late Pueblo 2, and then Pueblo 3 contexts. And if you think about the images from the beginning of the talk, where the the migration routes were happening, as the closer you get to 1450, the more centralized the archaeological record becomes. So that's part of what he's talking about. But before that, so for 1,000 years before that, 1,200 years before that, there's not real evidence of subsistence on turkeys. So why put all of that time and effort, and the corn specifically, you're growing corn as a subsistence crop for yourself, and you're feeding it to animals who you're not going to eat. You're not going to get that protein. So why? Well, we can turn to the people themselves, right? So this is an image of Coronado. And during his 1540 expedition, He said that, or he wrote down that we have found fowls, but only a few, and yet there are some. The Indians tell me that they do not eat these in any of the 7 villages, but keep them merely for the sake of procuring feathers. I do not believe this, because they are very good and better than those of Mexico. So let's take a minute to talk about this quote. So the first thing that strikes me is that, so this is at Zuni, and this is 1540. And there is some evidence in some areas that turkeys were being eaten, as I said, between 1200 and 1425. So, but that isn't that can't be used as a blanket statement for every community that was raising turkeys during that time period, because by 1540, they aren't eating them anymore, and they are specifically being kept for feathers. One thing I should point out at this point is that turkeys are, as far as I understand from my research, the only avian species in this area that can regrow feathers after being plucked. Every other species cannot regrow their feathers. So if you've ever raised chickens for eggs in your backyard or seen someone, once if another bird is pecking them, then there's just bare skin and it's a whole thing, right? But with turkeys, they can regrow their feathers. So keeping them and keeping them as a flock is a great way to be able to get feathers. The second thing from this quote is that, of course, Coronado does not believe the people he's interviewing, because his context is very different, and his manner is very different, and he is colonizing. And so, of course, he would like to show that that the people he's meeting and doesn't believe and thinks are less than him are lying about whether or not they eat these birds, which in the end is probably inconsequential for his purposes. It also says that he ate them. So it's not clear, since he knows that they're very good, it's not clear if he ate some of the flock of the Zuni people, or if his hunters were catching Miriam's turkeys out in the forest. Either way, those of Mexico at that time would have been the what's now the extinct subspecies. And that's important because that subspecies is the one that is the progenitor for all domesticated turkeys today here in the US and in Mexico. So, so apparently the other subspecies are more delicious than what we get from the store. And then I'd also like to point out this quote from Onyate's party. So this is a little bit later, 1598, just before the turn of the century. And again, we're still at Zuni, that the Zuni would offer turkey feathers to their idols and use them to create blankets, clothing, objects of adornment, and pouches. So here's again the map. If you haven't, if you aren't familiar with Zuni, the Zuni reservation is here, and it's in the middle. You'll see all the different pins around, right? It's in the middle of all of these places that that we're getting archaeological information from. So feathers, huh? This is an image of, excuse me, Mary Waukee. She's an archaeologist and anthropologist with the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. And she has done an amazing job at resurrecting this kind of, this turkey feather blanket weaving. So you can see here, the one that she has is over her shoulder. It's a 2 by 3 foot blanket. It took her 1.5 years to make, and 17,000 feathers from 68 turkeys. So if you take those if you take those statistics and you apply it to all of the archaeological contexts where we have turkey pens and we have turkeys that are molting and then also being plucked, that's a lot of turkey feathers and a huge reason why you would need flocks even if you're not eating them. If you think about cold nights up on the Colorado Plateau, having a blanket is a good idea. And I've heard some folks say that it might have been Mary saying that, you know, everyone would have had a blanket or a cloak of some sort. And I'll put this link into the chat at the end so you can read the article that this image comes from, and then she'll come back in a second. But so I wanted to show you some actual artifacts that also help us understand what we're hearing in the archaeological record, what we're hearing from descendants and then seeing in the archaeological record. So for me, it was my first obvious stop since I work for the Park Service is to look at what we have in the Park Service and what we've collected from different sites. So, and actually before we move on from that, I also wanted to talk about Ed Ladd, and I have a photo of him in a minute, but so he was a Zuni archaeologist who worked for the Park Service, and he worked at Montezuma Well, and then the Park Service sent him to Hawaii. So he had a great career in Hawaii. But he wrote a chapter for this book called Stars Above, Earth Below. And in it, he talks about the ethno-ornithology of the Zuni and talks about how feathers were so important ritually as well as for more everyday objects like a feather blanket. And specifically talks about prayer sticks and how the feathers that you tie onto a prayer stick have a specific order for different reasons, for different prayers. And turkey feathers figure in pretty much all of them. So back to our artifacts. So this is it's not the best picture in the world. I don't know if any of you can see it, but this first one is of a blanket or possibly a kind of a short cloak that was recovered at Bandelier that actually has feathers still attached. Mostly what we get, and this is actually from the Edge of the Cedars State Park, and an image that I pulled from Leap's article. What we get are the agave or yucca cordage that, if you can see these white stripes, though that's the very base of the feather, and I'm blanking on the proper term for that right now. But it would be soaked, and the feather would be wrapped around the cordage, and then another feather and another feather. So what you get after the insects have eaten off of the plume are just that center portion that's still wrapped around the cordage. This is another example of that from Wapatki National Monument, and it's actually interspersed with rabbit fur. And this is just cordage that would have been in preparation for for use in a blanket or a wrap. And rabbit fur was what was used prior to turkey feathers. So this is showing the kind of the crossover into use of turkey feathers. So that's not all though. We have other types of turkey artifacts, mostly using bone have a wide range and a wide distribution. So this bone flute, and there's a different one here that's along with hawk bone as well. So turkey and hawk bone flutes or whistles so they have been recovered from Montezuma Castle, which is not a site, you know, it's right below the Mogollon Rim. It's not a site that you would normally have turkeys associated with as far as being husbanded there, but the items that were made out of their bones were important enough and special enough and sacred enough to be traded down that far. And this is one from El Morro, which is up on the Colorado Plateau in New Mexico. So Ed Ladd is this guy right here in the dark suit and the nice collar, and so he's the one who, as I said, wrote about some sacred items at Zuni, and he was a Park Service archaeologist. He also writes that, you know, these items, like prayer sticks, are they're sacred, and they were meant to disappear back into the land, not disappear, but melt back into the land. And so having them on display, his point of having them on display isn't okay with the Zuni, and is a sign of colonialism. So so there are other artifacts that we have photos for, but I haven't included them here out of respect for that sentiment and the idea of hopefully starting to decolonize my talks specifically. And also along that line is there is an amazing video that Mary put together that's on YouTube, where she takes you through the process of making cordage, wrapping the turkey feathers, and then weaving the blanket. So, and it's an amazing video, and I really suggest that you watch it yourselves. And I will put that link into the chat, because it's much better coming straight from her than through my lens. So with that, I want to thank you for taking this trip and this overview, and thank the different authors whose work I've paraphrased. And I would love to answer some of these questions I've been seeing coming through.
Well,
and I'll keep sharing my screen. There are questions that that need photos to answer.
Sharlot, this is Butch, and thank you very much. I've got a number of questions here, 5 at least, several of which you've addressed, but I'll let you speak to them again. The first question is from Mark, and it's, what would cause the Merriams and Goulds to diverge?
So not being a wildlife ecologist, I'm not sure what causes different subspecies. But the Merriams and Goulds are classified as different subspecies. My point about kind of where that line is that especially in a historical context, it's hard to get enough data to show exactly where the line is between 2 different subspecies. So sorry, I don't have your exact answer.
Okay, well, thank you. So question number 2 and 3, again, you've addressed to some degree at least, and I'll combine them, I think. Turkey pen site, any shells of turkey eggs, any evidence people were eating the eggs, any ideas what those turkeys might have been used for, which you talked about. And I have read of turkeys feeding off insects from domesticated crops. Maybe this site was too early for farming?
So that's a lot of questions kind of all in one. I don't think they found any shells at the turkey pen site. I could be wrong, but I don't think they did. And so that's true. You know, you could have people eating eggs as part of the management of the flock. So, but they were using them for for feathers as well. And then as far as that site being too early for farming, no, the turkeys were being fed corn, and that's one of the exciting things about the research at the turkey pen site, is that it's so early that it's a great site where they were able to show that people were already somewhat sedentary and growing corn.
Well, and Kirk had a question prior to that, actually, and I think you've addressed it very well, but just talking more about the turkey pen site in Grand Gulch. Have you been to turkey pen site?
I actually haven't been, and I was talking to someone recently who took like a week-long trip through Grand Gulch and just was so happy with the trip and seeing a site every other step. So it's on my list.
Well, it should be. I've been there. I spent a week in Grand Gulch back in the 70s, and
Nice.
as you go down the canyon, after a while, and being a non-archaeologist, if the ruins didn't have more than 4 or 5 rooms, I just didn't go in it. There were just so many of them. So it's something you need to do, though.
Yeah. Yes, I do. And then we can have a follow-up talk after that.
Well, it's well worth it.
Yes,
Mark had a
great.
question about, I have read that ingestion of turkey increases through time. Did you find this to be true?
So essentially, yeah, Mark, it looks like there's kind of a break somewhere between 1050 and 1250 where people start eating them. But I think more research is needed, and in figuring out if it really is at sites that are having trouble with resource depletion outside of their sites, and how it figures in with the kind of coalescence at different sites. But yes, there is an increase in ingestion of turkey.
Okay, well, thank you. So, and then Kirk had another question. Are there rock art images of turkeys further north, for instance, in Wyoming or northern Utah?
Kirk, I know Kirk loves his rock art. I don't know. You'll have to tell me, Kirk. Let me know.
Okay, well, Kirk's going to have to give a presentation on that one, I think.
Yes.
Marilyn was wondering if the opening and closing photo or drawings were from Audubon, which looked like it to me.
Yes. Yes. They are.
And then Mary has one last question, perhaps, is how do you define domestication?
So for me, domestication is that early part when the animal is going from a wild animal to a managed flock, essentially.
Yeah, Mary asked that question. I forgot to mention that, I think, perhaps, but are there
So we
any
started
other
with
questions?
domestication, went through husbandry, and then use.
Yeah, Butch, there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Well, there's one more here on, oh, okay, never mind. You want to do the chat, Al?
Yeah, sure, I can take it. Let me open it here. Okay, by the way, I did put the web links in the chat. Charlotte, if you could remember to put yours in before you leave, that would be great. I had a question. Turkey remains are extremely rare, nearly non-existent in Hohokam archaeological sites, suggesting turkeys were absent from the Hohokam region, as you suggested. 10 years ago, the Arizona Game and Fish Department initiated a project to, quote, reintroduce turkeys to the Santa Catalina Mountains near Tucson and to other southeastern Arizona mountain ranges. When I asked their project manager, Jim Heffelfinger, whether there is any historical evidence that turkeys were ever present in the Santa Catalinas, he said there is such evidence and referred me to some information sources. So how would you reconcile the near absence of turkey bones from hohokam sites if turkeys in fact were present in the South Central Arizona environment?
So I would say that they're not, so you can't husband them at the hohokam sites. So what it would be more like a seasonal collection. You know, in the Catalinas, there's I mean, there are sites there, but they're not the same. They're not hohokam village sites, essentially. So, so if there was hunting specifically that was going on, then you might see more. I'm trying to read this as well. You might see more remains. Yeah, and the Santa Catalinas are sky islands, just like the Chiricahuas. So, so it would be, I would say that I reconcile this because you're not raising turkeys in hohokam sites. It's a resource that, just like you're not raising them in Sonawa sites like Munsima Castle and Tusigoot. So it would be a resource that you're going and getting rather than having right there. So the paucity of artifacts is due to that. And that they could be getting, like I said, like the whistles through trade. Yes. And so I think the definition for me is that they were present nearby, but they're not present right there. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, a question from Anne. Could eggshells, after eating the insides, have been ground up for various uses, thus producing little evidence of eating eggs?
Sure, they definitely could have been. And as I mentioned, they break really easily. They're not a great item to recover from an archaeological context. That Arroyo Hondo paper is really fascinating because they had, this clutch that was all together in the plaza that they could really look at, plus a few other shells from different contexts. So yeah, that's possible.
And now Charlotte Kirk is pointing out that there is a turkey petroglyph in Saguaro Park West.
Oh, well, there you go.
If I could comment on that, not everybody agrees that that's a turkey petroglyph. I know the one he's talking about.
Sometimes birds just look all alike to me, so there's that.
Okay, Mark has got another question here. So there are no turkey remains at Pueblo Grande, Casa Grande, or Mesa Grande, as far as you know.
That is correct.
Yeah, one of the few sites where I've read about turkey remains in hohokam sites is at the University Indian Run in Tucson, which might have been one bone.
Right. And that's actually the story I told about the bison bone is also from University Indian Run.
Yeah.
It was a special site, definitely. And really indicative of that, kind of north-south migration, indicative, but involved with that north-south migration that I talked about as well.
Charlotte, I don't see any further questions. Do you have any final comments you'd like to make before I thank you for doing this for us?
I thank everyone for listening to me and for the follow-up questions. This research is really new, and I clearly couldn't look at everything. I'm glad to have other folks who know about the rock art and everything. So, but thank you for listening, and yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to field those even in the future.
Well, well, Charlotte, on behalf of this group, and you had a nice audience tonight, a very knowledgeable group, uh, and thank you very much for presenting this to Old Pueblo Archaeology for us. And just as a reminder, she and Al have both put on several different websites to help answer some of these questions and to give you further information. So make sure you put that. And don't forget to maybe think about donating to Old Pueblo Archaeology as well. So Charlotte, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's fascinating to me. So thank you.
My pleasure. And I put both links in the chat so you can see the magazine article about Mary and then the YouTube video where she actually makes the blanket.
Okay, if people don't have a chance to copy that down before we close, you can email Old Pueblo Archaeology at info@oldpueblo.org, and I can provide those to you.
Okay.
And I'd like to thank
Thank
Charlotte
you, Al.
too. Thank you, Charlotte.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.